I'm delighted to be able to talk to you, and what I'm really doing is trying to provoke a discussion that will go on after this hour is over. I wrote the book because I began to realize in the course of my own work just how seriously we were impacting coral reefs, which was the ecological system that I knew. And I realized that most people don't really get it yet. We all know there are problems out there, but we haven't seen the totality and the seriousness. And I thought if I put it all together in a book, it might work that people would start to see the fact that this is a really big problem. So that's what we're going to try and do today. There is some good news towards the end of the talk, just as there is towards the end of the book. Now, one of the things I do when I give a talk like this is I like to start with a little thought experiment, and it may seem a little hokey, but bear with me. I'm going to ask you to each imagine that you live beside a forest. And it's not a forest you own, and you don't get the timber rights, and you don't sell firewood, and it's just there, and you enjoy the colors in the fall, and maybe you walk through it in the spring and see the flowers. But now imagine that one day you look up at the top of the trees and you notice that they're beginning to lose their leaves, and it's not the fall, it's the wrong time of year. And over a period of time, all of the trees are dropping their leaves. Even the conifers are dropping their needles. And as the trees drop their leaves, they're dying. And after a while, your entire forest, the forest that's been with you all those years, is dead. And you learn that the same thing has been happening to forests clear across the land because of something we did. And this is the question. Not what do you think about this, but how do you feel about it? And there are many things you might feel, but I would submit that you would probably feel some degree of sadness, some sense of loss. In some cases, it might even approach grief, a feeling that you have lost a friend you didn't really know. Mixed in with it, there would probably be some anger, anger at the government or the ministry for letting this happen. Anger at your fellow humans for doing what they did that killed the forests. But that sadness, that sense of loss, and that anger, I think most people would feel. And the reason I asked you to do that is because this is precisely what is happening to the world's coral reefs. And the tragedy is, or part of the tragedy is, that we don't know coral reefs the way we know forests. Most people have never seen one. Most people who have seen a coral reef have seen it once while snorkeling on a vacation. We don't live beside them. And although they are shouting out as loud as they can about the seriousness of the environmental crisis, we still don't get it. I'm going to come back to reefs, but first try and give you the messages that I hope to convey today. Can you hear me if I walk away from that thing? If I talk like this? Okay, because standing still drives me crazy. These are the messages that I'm going to try and convey today. A very large, multifaceted problem. Not a bunch of separate problems. It's not just global warming. It's not just climate change. It's a whole bunch of things that we are doing to the Earth at the same time. And together they are producing a perfect storm. It's not an exaggeration to say that this is the worst environmental crisis humanity has faced since the Pleistocene. In other words, the worst environmental crisis that civilization has ever had to deal with. The near-term future looks particularly bad for coral reefs, and I'll explain why that is so, but it's also bad for other parts of the world. And of course, as the world degrades, we suffer. And then finally, there is some good news, and the good news makes it worthwhile to fight for a better future. And what we badly need to do is get fighting. So what do I mean by a large, multifaceted global crisis? Well, here's a whole bunch of things. I suspect most of you know lots about most of them. And I'm not going to go through them in their entirety because some of them have very little to do with coral reefs. I mean, deserts are not exactly a problem for coral reefs. But this is what I mean. These are the range of things, and we could add some things in here that aren't here. These are the range of things that we are doing to the Earth. And I'll pick on the ones that are particularly prevalent in aquatic environments. So take overfishing. It's very rare for us to get a catch of fish like this these days, and that's not because we aren't trying to fish just as hard as we always did. If you take the FAO statistics on the commercial catch of fish, it's been going down since the mid-1980s. And it's been going down because the fish are not there. A study about 3 or 4 years ago out of Dalhousie University calculated that the total biomass of fish swimming in the ocean at the present time was 1/10 of what it was in the 1940s. That's how much we have depressed the abundance of fish in the ocean. And of course, it's the big fish which have suffered most because those are the ones we tend to prefer to catch. One can say, oh, well, we're going to have to eat something else. But this catch of fish provides 16% of the animal protein people eat. So it's not clear to me where we go for the alternative food when we run out of fish in the ocean. Never mind the fact that removing all those fish changes ocean ecosystems in dramatic ways and causes problems for the system itself. If we turn to pollution, you know that we pollute the air, the soil, and the water. We're very good at polluting. We are about as messy as the average rodent, as far as I can figure out. We're not very good at disposing of things we no longer want. And just one statistic for marine pollution, there are now over 400 what we call dead zones in the coastal ocean. 400 relatively large places where the amount of nutrients in the water is so high because of our pollution that the water is anoxic, and with anoxic water you get the loss of fishery species because they can't live there anymore. This is the second largest in the world. It's the western Gulf of Mexico. It's caused by the drainage from the Mississippi Delta. It grows in the summer, it shrinks in the winter, but as you can see, this color represents the degree of anoxia. It's very extensive, and it has had profound impacts on the ecosystems and the fisheries in that region. And I think it's very unfortunate, by the way, that the Deepwater Horizon spill, which happened somewhere down here, mainly affected the Eastern Gulf. It would have been so much better if we'd messed up the Western Gulf, because we'd already messed it up with this. This dead zone, we know what causes it, we know how to fix it, we're not fixing it. And this is just one of 400. Invasive pests. You hear a lot about invasive species in the Great Lakes. You hear a lot about invasive species in our forests and our other terrestrial environments. But this is a coral reef invader. A beautiful animal. It belongs in the Indo-Pacific. It is an important predator of small fish. It got into the Caribbean by way of aquarium escapes in Florida in the late 1980s. One story says 6 animals escaped during a hurricane, but that's probably an exaggeration. It was more than 6. It stayed quiescent for about 5 or 6 years, and then about 2005 began to spread and increase in numbers. It now occurs from the reefs of Brazil all the way up to North Carolina. It is in very high densities in some places. It is throughout the Caribbean. We don't yet know how serious an impact it's going to have because it hasn't been around very long, but it is eating an awful lot of small fish that have no defenses because they've never experienced this creature before. Biodiversity loss is probably one of the more interesting of these things we're doing because it sounds so calm. It sounds like we're talking about the loss of the Siberian tiger, which would be very unfortunate, or the loss of the polar bear, which would be very unfortunate, or maybe the panda. Biodiversity loss is much more than the loss of a few beautiful species. I chose this particular graph because it is so calm and soothing. The salmon pink is gentle. It doesn't look threatening at all until you realize that while this is a peculiar index of biodiversity, it shows a 30% drop in the space of 35 years. It is falling at a phenomenal rate. We're losing species about 1,000 times faster than normal. We're in the middle of what is now recognized to be the 6th mass extinction that the world has faced. The prediction by E.O. Wilson that we will have lost 50% of all living species by 2100 has not been seriously challenged. It may be well higher than that. And there are 25% of all marine species that occur on coral reefs, so it's going to have a significant impact in the ocean if we do things to coral reefs. You cannot lose 50% of the species on the planet without it making a difference. And not only does it make a difference to the natural world, it makes a difference to us because we depend on the natural world in many, many ways. So it's way more serious than people think it is, and people should be much more concerned about it than they are. Climate change is the one that everybody talks about. This is one random map. You can get one of these for every month for the last 10 years off the web, and they all look much alike. Lots of dark red, maybe even a little bit of purple, lots of yellow, warmer than average for the last 100 years or so. But climate change is much more than just a little bit of warming. The idea that in Canada climate change will be good for us because the winters will be milder is an idea that needs to be seriously challenged. What I've written down here is just a series of things that are happening because of climate change in the ocean. Never mind the land, just in the ocean. Warmer surface waters. More intense storms. We don't yet know if there are going to be more storms, but certainly the storms that we have are going to be more intense. And that's already happening. Stronger vertical stratification of the ocean because of the warmer surface layer. And with that stronger stratification, there is less easy mixing of the shallows and the deeper water, which means that the whole trophic system in the surface layer, the part where the sunlight gets down, that whole trophic system is compromised because there's no returning of nutrients at a regular time by the mixing with deeper waters. So that stronger vertical stratification is severe. Melting sea ice and glaciers, and one of the problems that people are worried about with melting sea ice and glaciers in the North Atlantic, there is the very real possibility of shutting down or slowing the thing that is known as the ocean conveyor, which is this giant deep water, shallow water cycle of water through the oceans of the world, which involves surface waters coming north in the Atlantic, cooling and sinking to the bottom of the ocean. There's a great probability that with all the fresh water around up there, they aren't going to sink, and that's going to stop it. And when you stop the ocean conveyor, you start doing things like making Europe very chilly, and other things beside. And of course, rising sea levels. I recently was interested in how fast sea level is rising, because you don't hear too much about it. So I looked it up, and over the last 10 years, sea level has risen at a rate of just a few millimeters. That is as fast as sea level rose at the end of the Pleistocene for 3,000 years, when all those glaciers were melting and sea level was rising very rapidly from 10,000 to 7,000 years ago. Since that time, 7,000 years ago, sea level has been nearly constant. It's now rising at the same rate it was rising before. And anybody who thinks that coastal cities don't suffer when you have rising sea level needs to visit Athens, not Athens, Venice, needs to visit Venice. Venice is a charming city, but we don't want all our cities to be places where you have to wear rubber boots to walk around the streets. And then finally, ocean acidification, which is perhaps the one thing on that list that some of you may not have been too sure of. Ocean acidification is caused by the same CO2 that is causing the warming of the climate. As we pump CO2 into the atmosphere by our use of fossil fuels and other things, about a third of that CO2 dissolves promptly into the surface waters of the ocean. Now that's a really good thing in the sense that it gets it out of the atmosphere, because if it stayed in the atmosphere, we'd be having even more rapid climate change than we're having. But when CO2 dissolves in the ocean, it dissociates, it forms carbonic acid, it shifts the pH ever so slightly in an acid direction. And this shift of pH is first of all happening at a rate and to a degree that has not happened for the last 350 million years, and they don't know before that because the data are not precise enough. In other words, it's a totally new phenomenon, and there are large numbers of organisms that live in the ocean that are being affected by it. It is affecting reproduction, it is affecting larval development, it is affecting animal behavior, it is affecting calcification. In the case of calcification, a great number of marine organisms build their skeletons out of calcium carbonate, and they combine calcium and carbonate in the water to build the crystal structure which becomes their skeletons. When you shift pH, the energy required to create solid calcium carbonate increases dramatically. And so what is happening is it is becoming more difficult for creatures to build their skeletons. These little guys here have nothing to do with the World Cup of soccer, although they sort of look like maybe they should. Sorry about that. Okay. I don't think it'll tighten.
No,
yeah,
won't tighten.
I'll just,
okay.
Yeah. These are coccolithophores. These are single-celled algae that happen to build an exoskeleton made up of these lovely little microscopic carbonate discs, which are cemented together. The organism is inside. These are one of the dominant members of the phytoplankton of the ocean. They're distributed throughout the oceans of the world. The surface waters of the ocean are responsible for 45% of all the primary production on Earth. 55% is done by plants on land, 45% phytoplankton in the ocean. That's photosynthesis to produce new organic matter to drive food chains and trophic webs and the whole biological activity of the ocean. So what these guys do is important. These particular individuals have been collected from different places around the world where acidification was proceeding further and further. So we've got normal seawater and most acid seawater. And you can see this poor misshapen creature back here with an incomplete skeleton. Now, we don't know if this this plant is less capable of photosynthesis, but I'll bet it is. We don't know if it's less capable of growth and reproduction, but I'll bet it is. Because when you take organisms and put them in a situation where they can't build their skeletons properly, they tend to be imperfect in lots of other ways. So ocean acidification is probably going to have profound impacts on the production of the ocean, which means the production of fisheries, which means food for people. This is a map of the acidification process. What this map is really about is what's called the surface aragonite saturation, but you can think of it as a map of the ease of creating calcium carbonate. Dark green, it's easy to make calcium carbonate. Dark red, it's very difficult. Temperature plays a role in this, as does ocean pH. This map, if the animation works, is going to run for 300 years. The first 200 are based on data, the last 100 a projection into the future. And I want you to see what happens because it's quite fascinating. Okay, it started. Now at first, we'll go 100 years and you'll see hardly any change. In fact, we'll go 150 years and you'll see hardly any change. We just got up to 1900, it's hardly shifted. 1950, it's hardly changed. You start to see some activity in the Eastern Pacific in the late 1900s. 2010 went past, look at it go. This is part of the problem that we face. Many, not all, but many of our impacts on the world are doing exactly that. They're starting slowly, they're getting rapidly worse, and then they speed up and speed up and speed up. 2050, the world is going to be in a very difficult situation. 2100, it's going to be in an even more difficult situation. I think this is a fascinating animation. It was produced recently by a guy in oceanography at the University of Hawaii. So let me return to coral reefs, because talking about acidification and calcification leads very nicely to coral reefs. And I want to try and say something about coral reefs to get you to understand why we should be very sad at the thought that we might be losing them. Coral reefs have been described as the Earth's most fragile ecosystem. In my book, I refer to them as wondrously improbable, and I'll try and justify that claim. We are so fortunate to have coral reefs with us to show us a way of being alive that we would never be able to imagine without them. It's the same for rainforests and some other absolutely fantastic environments, but coral reefs are really marvelous. I think you're all aware that the reef is the only natural ecosystem in which the whole thing is built by the organisms that live there. All of the rock on a coral reef is built as skeletons by the organisms, the corals and a bunch of other things that live there. And they build and they get destroyed by wave action and things like that, but it is an absolutely marvelous creation. They're very rare. They're rare because the primary organisms that build them, the corals, have got quite narrow tolerances for things like temperature, salinity, pollution, pH, light intensity, a whole range of things that limit where corals can occur. And they're limited to the tropics, but they're also limited to particular kinds of places in the tropics. And they only represent 1/1000th of the surface of the ocean. They're also ephemeral, and I may be peculiar because I get audiences looking at me and scratching their heads when I say they're ephemeral in space as well as in time. And maybe this is something I should just drop, but they really are ephemeral in space. Imagine you're with James Cook sailing his ship without a motor, and you discover you're upwind of a coral reef. You have about 2 kilometers to turn your boat around before you're on dry land, even though at the point where you discover you're upwind of the reef, you've got thousands of fathoms of water beneath your keel. That's what I mean by ephemeral in time. They pop up and they disappear just like that. And if you look out of a plane window, as I did once, and see an atoll in the middle of the Pacific, it is an amazing thing to see, and fascinating that it is there. More importantly, however, they're ephemeral in time. They've been with us a long time. They've been with us since the Mid-Ordovician, about 420 million years ago. And in those days, the corals were known as the rugose and the tabulate corals, and they built good big reefs until the end of the Permian. And with the mass extinction, reef building stopped. And reef building didn't start again for 25 million years. Just to keep you thinking about time, humans have been around for 2 million years, so this gap was 25 million years. That's a long time. And then coral reefs came back with the beginnings of coral reefs built by the scleractinian corals, and this is the type of coral that builds reefs today. So some of the tabulates survived through the gap, evolved into scleractinians, but there was no reef building during that time. The conditions were not suitable. At the end of the Jurassic, the same thing happened. This time the gap was about 15 million years, and then we came back again in the Cretaceous and persisted until the end of the Cretaceous. Another mass extinction, reef building stopped, and it didn't start again until the Eocene. In the Pleistocene, there were lots of interruptions, but they were of smaller scale, and there was actually continuous reef building from the Eocene through to the present. The point I'm making here, though, is that when reef building stops, it's because the ocean is no longer suitable for reef building. And with the absence of reef building, it appears that it takes a long time for normal processes to get the ocean back to being suitable again. So when I say that coral reefs could be disappearing, we're talking not about disappearing for a year or two. We're talking effectively about disappearing forever. From the point of view of a species that's been around for 2 million years, a species which has been civilized for, depending on your definition of civilization, 5, 6, 7,000 years, a 10 million year gap is effectively forever, okay? So disappearance of reef building would be a serious event. Coral reefs are also rich. They're rich in lots of ways. The number of species is an obvious way they're rich. Now, not all of this quarter of all marine species only live on reefs. Many of these species live off reefs as well. But reefs support a quarter of all the species in the ocean. And so they're important in that way. But they're also important in the range of organic chemicals that their species possess. They're important in the range of behavioral complexity where species interact with each other. We could go on and on and on talking about the wonderful complexity of coral reefs. They are rich. They are a tremendous source of information and opportunity for understanding the natural world. And losing them is losing something substantial. And then finally, they're valuable. They're obviously valuable biologically or ecologically, but they're also very valuable economically to the countries that have them. Australia currently values the Great Barrier Reef at $6 billion a year with a B, just for its ability to attract tourists to the continent. $6 billion a year. And it has other values beyond that. If you go through the Caribbean basin, nearly all the countries in that basin have more than 50% of their GDP coming from coastal activities. Those coastal activities are chiefly fishing and tourism, and both of those are intimately tied to coral reefs. Lots of Canadians have had vacation experiences in Cancun, and you fly down and you go to the hotel and you get the little bracelet around your wrist and you discover the drinks are watered down, but you have a good time and you go home again and you never saw a coral reef. But the reason Cancun is there is because of this sandy beach. And the reason this sandy beach is here is because of those calcium carbonate building organisms that live on the reef that's offshore and behind the reef. And with the loss of those organisms that are able to build that sand, the sand won't be there, and without the sand, they probably wouldn't have established the hotels. So the value of the reef to the hotels should not be ignored. Never mind the fact that that reef sitting out there dissipates an enormous amount of the energy of cyclones and hurricanes, and the destruction to those hotels in a hurricane would be much greater if the reef wasn't around. So tremendous value for fishing and tourism, and obviously there are many places in the developing world where rural communities feed their families from the fish that reefs produce, and that can't be undervalued. So despite all these good things about reefs, they're underappreciated and they're disappearing. They're underappreciated because we're just really good at making a mess of the world. We've been doing it for a long time, and we haven't spared coral reefs, and reefs are sensitive, so they perhaps get impacted more than other systems. We overfish on reefs, we pollute reefs, we develop them inappropriately. Overfishing. This is a graph that looks at sustainable fishery yield against actual fishery yield. So a sustainable fishery would be on that line. Here's a whole bunch of places around the world that have coral reef fisheries, and you'll see there's a lot of red ones here. These are ones that the fisheries officers acknowledge are being overfished, and it's quite clear that they are. They're all above this line. The green ones are ones that fisheries officers believe are being sustainably fished, and that seems to be true, although there's a couple getting a bit close to the line here. There are some back here that maybe could be fished more intensively. The gold ones are ones that they think may have some problems with them, and indeed a couple of them are overfished. And then there's the black ones. Those are the ones that have been overfished and they've already collapsed, and they now yield less fish than they used to because they have been degraded. It turns out that about 50% of places around the world that have coral reefs are either being currently overfished or are already degraded. The reason for overfishing on reefs is pretty simple. Local population growth in the countries that have reefs increases the demand for fish. Tourism, which is a very good thing in lots and lots of ways for these countries, creates an insatiable demand for reef fish. The live restaurant trade out of Asia and the aquarium trade both mean that for coral reefs, any place that you can get to an airport from, you have the world as your market. So the demand for reef fish is very, very high. And then, of course, something that's characteristic of fisheries nearly everywhere, poor regulation, ineffective marine protected areas. It's no wonder that we overfish coral reefs. There's also some information suggesting that in some cases we're running out of time to turn things around. This is a story about the Nassau grouper, a wonderful eating fish, an important fish in the Caribbean. And Enric Sala did a study at the spawning aggregation site at Glover's Reef, Belize. This is one of 2 places in Belize where Nassau grouper aggregate each spring to spawn. There used to be 13 such places in the country. Now there are only 2 because of us. And he went to this one and he counted the number of fish aggregating. And you can see the story he got. And as I've said in other talks, these data are the undergraduate's dream because, oh, I've got data, I can draw a straight line through them and finish my lab report. And a statistician would think these data were really nice because they fit the straight line very well. Of course, what that straight line is telling us is really rather sad. This spawning aggregation is on the way out. The really bad thing about this is 2001 was the year when Belize Fisheries very bravely put in place new regulations closing spawning aggregation sites to fishing during the spawning season. They put it in place well. It was well enforced. There was very little, if any, poaching. And you can see it had no effect whatever on that decline. The fisheries officers put this new regulation in place on the advice of scientists. The scientists didn't realize that the pressure on that species in Belize is so great at the rest of the year that it's too late for this to have an effect. If they had done this back here when the scientists were first talking about it, it probably would have had a dramatic effect. But it's had no effect. And that's very sad because the next time the scientists make a good suggestion, the fisheries managers will remember the bad result this time. It's too late. We're running out of time. Managing fisheries on coral reefs is technically possible, but politically and culturally very difficult because we've got to reduce demand locally from tourists and globally. And in many places around the world, the reefs are supporting populations that are feeding their families with the fish they catch and then selling a few for a little bit of extra money. What do these people do to feed their families if fishing is no longer possible for them? People talk about alternative livelihoods, but these guys don't have bachelor's degrees in computer science. So what are the alternative livelihoods available to them? They're doing the best they can feeding their families. And incidentally, this guy can come to shore, put these fish on a truck, they can get to the airport and go to Japan and sell for a very good price. So it's easy to solve the problem, except it's also very difficult. Pollution. I think this is probably the saddest photograph of a turtle I've ever seen. Our team in Dubai had monitored this reef about 3 months before this photograph was taken. It was a rich reef, high in coral cover, high in coral diversity, high in fish abundance and diversity, and then a red tide came through. Red tides didn't used to affect coral reefs because red tides occur in enclosed waters high in nutrients, and coral reefs don't occur in those kind of places. But now we're producing red tides in places where they never used to occur, and this is happening. If you talk about pollution on coral reefs, sooner or later Kaneohe Bay in Hawaii comes up. It's a wonderful bay with a reef separating it from the open ocean, lots of little patch reefs inside. And when I was there in the late 60s, those patch reefs looked like this. Lots of coral, healthy coral. And then in the 70s, they started to look like this. Masses of algae smothering the coral, killing the coral off, because the entire bay was becoming nutrified because there was development of the town of Kaneohe and the coastal area around the bay. There was runoff. There were 2 sewage outfalls which were dumping directly into the bay. It was obvious what was happening. And in 1979, they in fact extended the sewage outfalls beyond the edge of the bay to get that water out of there. Nutrients improved in the water, but there were so many nutrients in the system by then, the algae didn't go away until late in 2006 for a reason that has nothing to do with what the scientists were trying to do. It is a classic story of pollution, and it is also a story that shows that while we know what the causes are and we can sometimes put remediation in place, the remediation often doesn't lead to a quick response from the system. The system responds in its own time. And this is something that we did, or actually Hanneke did, and Chris, and some people in Mexico. This goes back to Cancun. These are all cenotes where tourists get to snorkel. All the hotels in Cancun have toilets, believe it or not, and they get used, and the sewage is put after treatment deep into underground wells, and then it's forgotten about. But the Yucatan Peninsula is a limestone bench riddled with channels and water flowing through, and the cenotes are the openings of those channels, and they're wonderful places for tourists to snorkel in. We put collectors well upstream of where the tourists are, back in the caves, just to see what was in the water, and we didn't even bother to measure nutrients. None of these amounts are anything that approaches being dangerous for humans, but we don't know what is dangerous for reef organisms, and this water flows through these cenotes and out to the open ocean. And you know, whether reefs thrive on cocaine or not, we don't know, but we're putting it out there along with the ibuprofen and the naproxen and everything else. We are very careless about what we do with the waste products we have. We rely on dilution as the solution. We rarely think about pollution until something dramatic happens. And quite frankly, in developing countries, you would need major improvements in technical capacity simply to measure what's in the water. They don't know. So it's a hugely serious problem. Inappropriate development I can do very simply. Lots of reefs are closely associated with mangroves, which produce, among other things, nursery habitat for reef creatures. And in many cases, we improve coastal areas by getting rid of mangroves and replacing them with hotels. When you take the nurseries away, what do the children do? We're increasingly coastal. Our cities, our agriculture, our industry all pollute. We delight in doing things we call reclamation. It's not reclamation at all, it's thievery. We steal from the ocean to build land that was never there before. Beach replenishment, the only reason it needs replenishment is the beach shouldn't have been there in the first place. Coastal protection does very good jobs of protecting the coast and very bad jobs of protecting what's outside the coast. So lots of problems in inappropriate development. But then finally, warming and acidification. All of these things are local. A country or a province or a city or a single town can decide to take care of its reef with respect to these things, regardless of what the neighbors do. And you could have some good effects. But when it comes to warming and acidification, those are global pressures, and no country, no small town can hope to protect its reef from the effects of warming and acidification. And this is the real problem for coral reefs at the present time. To understand this problem, you need to understand something about corals. They're animals. They have symbiotic single-celled algae that live in their tissues, do photosynthesis, produce sugars that the animal uses. The waste products of the animal are the nutrients for the algae. It's a beautiful little system for making both the animal and the algae happy. When the animal is stressed physiologically, like the water's too hot or the water's too polluted or the water's too cold or whatever, when it's stressed, one of the things it does is evict its algae. And when it evicts the algae leave, and the algae have pigments, but the animal itself is translucent. And so suddenly what you see is a transparent animal, a thin veneer of tissue over the white crystalline skeleton. So it looks like the coral has suddenly bleached. And we call it coral bleaching. And as a stress response, it has been known for 60 years that corals do this. But it was not until 1982 that anybody saw what we call mass coral bleaching, when acres of coral turn white overnight. It happened in 1982 on the west coast of Panama and in the Galapagos. It's happened a number of times since then. 1998 was perhaps the worst year, when there was bleaching across the Indian Ocean, the Pacific, and the Caribbean. When corals are bleached, they can recover, but if the conditions remain bad for several weeks, they start to die. And it's estimated now that we have already lost 20% of all the coral that existed on Earth in 1980. In other words, the total area of living coral has been reduced by 20% since 1980. It's been seen many times since 1998. Tends to be less impressive now for unfortunate reasons. Many damaged reefs show little recovery, and the frequency of coral bleaching is likely to increase as temperatures get even warmer. Because what is happening is slightly warmer waters coupled with seasonal variation in temperature, you get these bursts of extra warm water that induces bleaching. What I say in the book is that coral reefs as we knew them in the 60s and 70s are unlikely to be with us, or I say will not be with us in 2050, assuming we go along doing what we're doing now. And that's not a new statement, although it might be new in a popular book. This paper came out in Science in 2007. I was one of about 20 authors of it. And in this paper, we talk about acidification and warming and their effects on corals. And we used this illustration to try and make the message concrete to people. So what we have at the bottom here is concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, and a picture of what reefs might be like under those circumstances. 375 we last saw about 1990. It's now 394. 450 to 500, very little in the way of branching coral left. Massive corals still hanging in there. Lots of algae. More than 500, basically a rubble-strewn limestone bench covered with a turf of algae. A place devoid of diversity, fewer fish as well as fewer species of fish, a very different kind of place, and certainly not growing to keep up with sea level rise. The future for coral reefs under business as usual has to recognize the following things: continued growth of our population, increasing use of fossil fuels, increasing direct pressure on reefs and climate pressures, and those things will produce these: continued overfishing, more pollution, more frequent bleaching, failure of reefs to regrow because acidification slows down their ability to recover from bleaching, and disappearance of reefs as we know them. Now there is some good news. Not much, but a little. This is some work that some of us are working on at the moment. I hope it will one day become a publication. It seems to have stalled. What we've done in this graph is plot the density of humans per square kilometer of reef in local parts of the world. This is a global study. The density of humans around the reef and the relative pressure on the reef due to warming and acidification, because warming and acidification are more likely extreme in some parts of the world than others. For instance, the Florida Keys are favored. They're further towards the edge of the tropics, and things are going to prevent them become acidified as rapidly as some other places. So we've got the pressure on reefs and the pressure of humans on reefs, which will create all those local effects. And what you see is there's a lot of reefs in, this is for 2050. For 2050, there's a lot of reefs up here that are in a really bad place. It doesn't look very promising for them. But there are some reef regions, and the three colors are the three oceans. There are some reef regions in places where they're lucky. And this suggests that we could, if we focus our efforts in these places, do something useful to protect those reefs and get them through this crisis while we learn how to be better stewards of the earth. I know that sounds like triage, and we're not supposed to talk about triage, but triage saves lives on the battlefield, and we're in a battle in the environment. More good news. This came out in late 2009. It was a study of an extensive bleaching that occurred on the Great Barrier Reef, and very simply they looked at the threshold temperature at which corals in different locations bleached. And what they found was that in places where the threshold was high, those were also places where the nutrient levels in the water was lowest. In other words, if you take care of the pollution, you give the coral the benefit of a couple of degrees of resistance to heating. That's a lovely argument for not giving up on dealing with the local problems. And then this one came out just before Christmas, or just after Christmas, sorry. A very interesting set of observations to do with a bleaching event in 2010. This site in western Sumatra looks fairly typical. The branching corals are most susceptible to bleaching, and they're the ones that have bleached predominantly. These two in Singapore and in Malaysia are very peculiar in that the massive corals have bleached and the branching corals haven't. This hasn't been seen before, and it may represent an evidence that corals are sometimes capable of adapting. These places had been bleached in the recent past, and maybe those corals are more tolerant to temperatures now than they were before. And we've got to wait for the massive ones to catch up with them, but the branching ones seem to be doing well. That's possible. It's also possible there's some other explanation. It's never been seen before, and people have been looking at bleaching since the early 1990s. And I threw this one in because I do work on fish. It's nice to see that people can create marine protected areas that are actually protected, and the biomass of fish actually increases. There's nothing wrong with the tool, it's just that usually we don't apply it very well. The most likely future for coral reefs. I think coral reefs could well become the first ecosystem we've destroyed, which I think bears reflection upon. We've been very good at causing extinction of species, but this looks like the first ecosystem we're actually going to eliminate, and I think that says something about us. Alternatively, of course, and this is what I hope will happen, they could become the spur that galvanizes us into some kind of action. Now, I don't know how we're going to galvanize some of us into action. I have been known to say that I would love to take Stephen Harper diving on a reef. But I can't decide if I want to give him a really good experience or whether I want to shut off his air. I'm going to finish up with some comments about the future. And the first comment, of course, is you cannot predict the future. What we have here is a series of trends. Trends caused by us. Trends of overfishing. Trends of production of CO2 into the atmosphere, trends of pollution, so on and so forth. How those trends project into the future will determine what the future is like. And of course, we don't know how they're going to predict, how they're going to trend. As an example, to show you how you could work through it, I'm taking the trend in production of CO2. These are the real data. These are the data from Mauna Loa. Since 1958, they've been sampling CO2 in the atmosphere. This is the line. It's updated every month on the web. You can download it. It's free. Anybody who believes that the climate scientists designed global climate change as a spoof to generate money to go into their labs has to reflect on the fact that they put these instruments out in 1958. And the climate scientists in 2010, who are apparently reaping the benefit of all this money, well, how old were they in 1958? This is real planning for a climate scientist. Obviously, it isn't a spoof. But here's the curve. There's a very dramatic change in a rather short period of time. And if we continue the way we're going, it's going to do that, right? That's pretty reasonable. We might get serious about doing something about it and achieve that, or we might even get really serious and achieve that. We're probably not going to be able to swing it down even more steeply. In fact, this is probably over-optimistic. But those come to three very different futures out here. And we could do the same thing with all those other trends. One of the things we need to be doing, as well as looking at trends, is thinking about the need to change the trajectories. You all know there was a climate conference in Durban in November. The outcome of that conference was an agreement to come back in 2015 when they will have a treaty which they can all agree to, which will be put in place by 2020. This was greeted by the people at the conference as some sort of an achievement. I think it sounds like kicking the can down the road. Let's see what it does. That's what it does. By 2020, we know we're going to be up at that star. This future is impossible. We can't get there because we have agreed not to do anything until 2020. That's the big problem with the environmental crisis. We have got to start acting because these things take time, and if we continue delaying, the difficulty becomes ever greater. The problem, of course, is that we are, too many of us, taking too much without thinking about it. The coral reefs are trying to give us an urgent message. What should we change to get to a good future? And I'm not going to be presumptuous enough to tell you what we need to do. What we need to do first is start discussing the problem seriously and start reaching some agreement. But I am going to put out 3 general statements that I think we really need to tackle quickly. And the first one is we have got to reduce our use of fossil fuels, and I don't care whether that hurts the Alberta economy or not. We don't need it, and we should leave it in the ground, and same thing should be happening for a lot of other fossil fuels. It's time we stopped asking the oil companies for advice on this subject, because their advice is unlikely to include using less oil. There are many different ways of transitioning through away from fossil fuels. Improving efficiency would help a lot. Some conservation would help. But most important of all, we need to treat energy as if it were precious instead of thinking of it as something that should be cheap. I don't like the current gas prices, but I'm really glad they're up there. The second thing we need to do, and this may be even more difficult, is we need to start talking about the human population and recognizing that it is out of control, and that the complacency with which we are waiting for 9.2 billion people in 2050 is frightening. I personally think it will be exceedingly difficult to provide food and water for 9.2 billion people, and raising standards of living around the world, as we say we want to do, will be even more difficult if we allow the population to continue to grow. It has been taboo to talk about the human population since the 1970s. It shouldn't be taboo anymore. There are lots and lots of ways to influence people's choices, and if advertising can make you want things you never knew existed, I'm sure they could make you want smaller families. And hey, being an uncle can be a really good career choice. So, you know, we need to talk about it. It's serious. I don't think we can reach a good future for us if we allow the population to continue the way it's going. And then the final thing we need to do may seem surprising, but I'm beginning to think this may even be the first thing we need to do. Those of us who have a Western culture, and that's basically the developed world, we need to learn from other cultures. We need to recognize we're part of the natural world, not owners of it. I love this photograph. It's dawned on me recently that half the people in the world have never known a time when this photograph didn't exist. But I remember when it didn't exist. I remember when those Apollo 8 astronauts went behind the moon for the very first time, and people actually saw the back of the moon with their own eyes. And when they came out from behind the moon, that's when they saw the Earth in the sky of the moon. And that's when they realized how alone we are. We share it. It's the only one like it in the near universe. If we use up everything on it, we can't go next door for some extra. So we need to be acting as stewards, not as plunderers of its resources. I love this photograph. I'll show it to you without the words in a moment. The frustrating thing to me is we don't need a lot of new technology to make the changes I'm talking about, but new technology will come. But we've got enough knowledge. We can do it. What we don't have at the moment, of course, is a consensus of what we want, and we don't have the will to act. And we need to get the will to act. And countries have got to go to international conferences with a view that they are there to work together to achieve something, rather than the present, which is they're there to protect their own self-interest, short-sighted self-interest. I would like a future in which children have smiles on their faces. There are many children, even today, that don't have smiles on their faces. these kids in a little Philippine fishing village do. And it's lovely to see it. I would like the future to be like that. Thank you.